It was a normal Friday evening. I had just finished a long week at work, and the last thing I wanted was to go out and socialize. Instead, I opted for a quiet night at home, something I had been looking forward to all week. The house was completely empty. I was alone. Or so I thought. My name is Jake, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the outskirts of Cleveland. A place that, on the surface, seemed like nothing could ever go wrong. I had recently moved in, just a few months ago, and was still getting used to the place. The house was large, old but well-maintained, with creaky floorboards and thick, drafty walls. Perfect for a horror story, right? But that wasn't why I felt unsettled. No, the feeling that night was something else. It started with a sound. A faint tapping noise. It was almost imperceptible at first, like someone was tapping their fingers lightly on a window, but I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the wind or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again. More persistent. And closer. I froze. My heart rate spiked. I glanced at the front door and the window beside it. Nothing. Yet the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I turned off the TV and listened intently. Silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was walking around outside, moving around my property, but I hadn't heard a car pull up, and no one had knocked. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. Should I call the police? Was I being paranoid? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Someone who knew I was alone. The minutes stretched, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. My mind raced. Why was I suddenly so sure something was wrong? It was like my body had entered survival mode, alert and waiting. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked, but as I did, I noticed something. A faint shadow just outside the front window, passing by. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then everything went black. I waited in the darkness, my pulse pounding in my ears, as I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. I couldn't breathe. The door handle was still turning, but no one had knocked, and there was no sign of anyone. I gripped my phone in my hand, the screen illuminating my fingers in the darkness. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios. I could call 911. But if they were already inside, would it even matter? I crept toward the hallway, my breath shallow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The house, which had felt so comforting just hours ago, now felt like a trap. A place I didn't belong in anymore. The darkness outside was alive, almost mocking me. The handle stopped moving. I stood still, barely daring to blink, my eyes locked on the front door. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, the faintest sound came from the kitchen, soft, like a chair scraping against the floor. Someone was inside. Panic surged through me. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? The house had too many rooms, too many corners. My eyes darted to the windows, no way out. The back door was a mile away, and even if I made it there, would I make it before the intruder caught up? I stepped backward, inching toward the living room. My phone buzzed in my hand, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my friend, Ben. I had texted him earlier, letting him know I was staying in tonight. Everything okay? The text read. I wanted to respond, but it felt like a distraction. I didn't want to look away from the hallway, where the shadow seemed to grow longer with each passing second. Another scrape. The sound was coming from the kitchen again, this time closer. Someone was moving carefully, methodically, and I could hear the faintest whisper of someone breathing. I had to make a decision. I could stay hidden and hope they didn't find me, or I could try to confront whoever it was. But something deep down told me it wasn't just a random burglar. This felt different. The deliberate silence. The way they were moving, slow, patient, like they were hunting. I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and slowly, quietly, moved toward the kitchen. My foot caught on the edge of a rug, but I stopped myself from making any sound. Every nerve in my body screamed to stop, to hide, but I had already committed. As I reached the doorway to the kitchen, my flashlight caught something. A shadow, no, a figure, was crouching behind the refrigerator. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, like the reflection of a predator. They weren't looking at me. They were staring at the space between us, waiting for me to make the next move. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as the figure slowly stood up. It wasn't human. The figure stood there in the shadows, its outline barely visible in the dim light of the flashlight. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat a loud, suffocating echo in the quiet room. I could barely process what I was seeing. The figure wasn't just someone in a mask or a person hiding in the dark, it was something else. Its face, or what I could make out of it, was twisted. The skin was too pale, almost ashen, and stretched tight over a skull-like structure. Its eyes were wide, but not in a way that suggested surprise or fear. No, these eyes were wide with hunger. Its pupils were thin slits, and the glow I saw earlier wasn't from the flashlight, it was coming from deep within, like some unnatural light was emanating from inside of it. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. The air felt thick with something unexplainable, a coldness that crawled up my spine and made every part of me freeze in place. The creature tilted its head slowly, like it was studying me, analyzing me, trying to figure out if I was worth the risk. I backed away just a step, but that seemed to trigger it. The creature lunged forward, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to. It wasn't running, it was gliding, sliding across the floor, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, each step a jarring reminder that this thing was not human. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat as my body screamed for me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Panic flooded me, and I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. My mind screamed that I had to get out, but every logical thought had evaporated. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't something that could be outrun. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it with shaking hands and, without thinking, pressed the first number that came to my mind, Ben. He was the closest thing to a friend I had in this town. I barely managed to get the words out as I dialed. Ben, there's something in my house. Someone's here, and it's not a person. Please, help. But as the phone rang, the creature let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any growl I had heard before, it felt wrong. A mix of rage and something primal, something older. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I didn't care anymore. I had to survive. The growl escalated as the creature moved closer. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the faint light. I turned and ran. I didn't think about where I was going, I just knew I had to get away from that thing. I bolted through the hallway, past the stairs, and into the living room. My mind was racing, trying to think of anything, to defend myself. My eyes scanned the room in a frenzy, finally landing on the fireplace poker that leaned against the wall. I grabbed it, my fingers slipping on the metal as I gripped it for dear life. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, but it wasn't the creatures, the door was opening. I turned just in time to see Ben standing there, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. But before I could say anything, the thing lunged. I barely had time to process what was happening before the creature moved again. It lunged towards Ben, its long, unnaturally thin arms reaching out with terrifying speed. Ben screamed, but there was no time to help him. My instincts took over, and I swung the fireplace poker with all the force I could muster, aiming straight for the creature's head. The impact was sickening. The poker connected with a sharp crack, but the creature barely flinched. It was like hitting a wall made of stone. The creature's eyes locked onto me, and I could see that sickly glow intensify, a terrible hunger building in its gaze. Ben tried to scramble away, but his legs gave out beneath him. He was on the floor, helpless, as the creature advanced toward him. I had to do something, anything, to stop it. In that moment of sheer terror, I remembered something. A small detail from when I first moved into the house. The previous owners had left behind an old cabinet in the basement, filled with strange artifacts and odd trinkets. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but I remembered now that some of the items had strange symbols carved into them, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked almost ritualistic. Without a second thought, I pushed past Ben, heading for the basement door. The creature roared behind me, its growl echoing in the house like an animal driven mad. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the basement door, my hands shaking as I yanked it open. The air was musty, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I ran down the stairs, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The cabinet was in the far corner, just as I remembered. My breath came in ragged gasps as I hurried toward it, fumbling with the door as I pulled it open. Inside, there were countless objects, strange stones, old books, and the trinkets I remembered. But what caught my eye was a large, dark amulet hanging from a shelf. It was made of some strange material, and the symbols carved into it were the same ones I'd seen in the basement. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me told me that this was the key to ending this nightmare. I grabbed the amulet and raced back up the stairs, my mind focused entirely on survival. As I reached the top, I could hear the creature again, its growls echoing through the house. But Ben wasn't screaming anymore. It was silent. Too silent. I didn't think. I just acted. I ran into the living room, the amulet clutched tightly in my hand. The creature had stopped moving, its eyes were fixed on me, its mouth slightly open, showing those horrid teeth. It looked almost curious now, like it knew what I was holding. It knew what it could do to me. I held the amulet in front of me, trembling as I whispered whatever words came to my mind, the ancient symbols on the amulet glowing faintly in response. The creature hissed, recoiling slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it snarled, more viciously than before. And then, to my shock, it stepped back. I don't know what happened next. One moment, it was there, moving toward me, filled with an unnatural hunger. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Disappeared. Vanished into thin air, leaving only a faint smell of decay in the room. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. My body was trembling, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. Was it over? Was it really gone? Ben, who had somehow managed to crawl to the doorway, looked at me with wide eyes, his voice hoarse. What was that? What just happened? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the creature had been or how it had come to my house. I didn't know what the amulet had done, only that it had worked, somehow. The terror that had consumed me for what felt like an eternity was finally fading, leaving behind only confusion and exhaustion. Ben helped me to my feet, his grip strong but shaking. We didn't speak much after that. Neither of us had the words. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever had happened in that house, it was something real. And I wouldn't forget it. I couldn't. That night, after Ben left, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the front door. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I knew now that something was out there, something that couldn't be explained. I had survived, but I couldn't forget the darkness that still lingered just beyond the edges of the light. And I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, it would return. Weeks passed since the incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever that creature had been, it was gone. Ben and I spoke about it occasionally, but we never went into detail. Some things are better left unspoken. Still, I couldn't forget. Every time I walked past the front door, I'd pause and listen. Every creak in the house would make my heart skip a beat. It wasn't fear anymore, but a constant, nagging feeling that something was waiting. Watching. Waiting for the right moment to return. And then it happened. It was late at night, and I had just finished working on a project. I was tired, exhausted even, but something told me that I should check the locks on the doors before going to bed. I walked through the house, making sure every window was shut tight, every door secure. As I approached the front door, something stopped me. The faintest sound, just a whisper, came from the other side of the door. I stood still, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I felt my stomach twist in knots. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, hesitated for a moment, and then twisted it. Nothing. The door didn't budge. It was locked. I breathed a sigh of relief, but then, almost as quickly as the tension had lifted, it returned. The tapping, soft at first, began again. It was like a rhythmic knocking, so subtle that I almost thought I was imagining it. But no. The taps were there, and they were getting louder. It wasn't the wind this time. It wasn't a branch against the window. The sound was coming from inside the house. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I wasn't alone. I moved cautiously through the hallway, toward the source of the sound. The house was eerily quiet now. The air seemed thick with something I couldn't name. As I walked, I passed the kitchen. There, just for a split second, I saw a shadow dart past the doorway. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a figure, a silhouette, and it was moving fast. I froze. My pulse raced. I didn't know whether to scream or run. But my legs wouldn't move. I stood there in silence, waiting for something to happen. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but then I heard it again, the tapping. But now it was joined by something else, a low, growling sound, guttural and deep. The same noise I had heard the night I first encountered the creature. I turned slowly, my breath shallow, and looked toward the living room. The shadows seemed to shift, as if the very air in the room was alive. And there, in the corner, was the thing again. It was more grotesque than before, larger, more menacing, with skin that seemed to ripple and distort with each movement. Its eyes glowed, the same sickly light as before, but now it was as if the light was coming from within, burning brighter, more intense. Its mouth was open, revealing rows of teeth that stretched unnaturally far back, like they had been designed to tear through flesh. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. The creature stepped forward, its movement smoother, faster, and somehow, it seemed more aware of me this time. It was waiting for me to make the first move. I turned and ran. I didn't care where. I didn't care about anything except getting away from it. I could feel its presence behind me, its breath hot on my neck, and I knew it was gaining. The house was no longer my sanctuary. It was a cage. I darted toward the back door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't open. The door was locked, just like the front one. I pulled harder, desperate, but it wouldn't give. That's when I saw it, an old, ornate key sitting on the kitchen counter. It was large, made of brass, and the shape was unusual, almost as if it had been designed for something specific. The creature's growl deepened as it came closer, its eyes locked onto me, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the key and shoved it into the back door lock. The door swung open. I bolted outside, my heart pounding in my chest, the air freezing against my skin. I ran across the yard, not daring to look back. I didn't know if it was following me or not. I didn't care. I kept running, until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door, breathless and frantic. I didn't explain everything, but they saw the terror in my eyes, and they let me in. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The house was empty now, but the fear was still inside me. I knew that whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. And it wasn't done with me. It would return. The following days blurred into one long nightmare. I stayed at the neighbor's house, refusing to return to my own. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. The creature was still out there, waiting for me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't know what it was or why it had come after me in the first place. I called Ben. He didn't pick up. I sent him a message, asking if he could meet me. I needed answers. But when he finally replied, it wasn't what I expected. "I think I know what's going on," his text read. "Meet me at your house." I didn't want to go back. I knew I couldn't face whatever was still lurking in my home. But I also knew Ben wouldn't let it go. He was stubborn like that. So, reluctantly, I returned to my house, heart racing as I approached the front door. It looked normal. Too normal. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Ben was waiting for me inside. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he'd found something important. As soon as I walked in, he held up the key I had used to escape. I froze. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice trembling. It was the same key, the one I'd used to unlock the back door that night. The same key that had felt so familiar, like it belonged to something that had been buried long ago. Ben looked at me, his expression grave. I was doing some research. I went through a few old books on the house, trying to figure out what could have caused all this. I found something. A history of the house and the land it was built on. I sat down, unable to speak, just waiting for him to continue. He sat across from me, looking uneasy. This house was built on land that was cursed. The original owner was into some pretty dark stuff, rituals, sacrifices. It was believed that he opened a door to something, not human. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. And every so often, it comes back. I felt a chill wash over me. "What are you saying?" "That thing, it's not just a random intruder." Ben nodded slowly. "No. It's something ancient. And that key you found? It's the key to locking whatever it is inside the house. The people who built the house, they knew it had to be kept contained. The key was passed down, kept hidden, to ensure the creature could never get out." I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the weight of everything was pressing in on me. The creature wasn't just some random entity. It was a force, something that had been bound to the land for generations. Why didn't it leave after I used the key? I asked, desperate for some kind of answer. "Because you didn't lock it," Ben said quietly. "The key only works if you close the door. Literally. You unlocked it, but you didn't lock it again. And as long as that door is open, even a crack, it can come back. And it will, again and again, until you do what's necessary." I stood up, my legs shaky. "What do I have to do?" Ben looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You need to return to the house. Go to the back door. Use the key again. And this time, lock it. For good." The room felt suddenly colder. I wasn't sure I could do it. The thought of going back into that house, of facing that creature again, made my stomach turn. But Ben was right. It wasn't over. I had to finish it. For once and for all. We drove back to my house together, the tension in the air palpable. Every inch of the house felt different now. The air was thick with something I couldn't explain. As we approached the back door, I could feel the creature's presence again. It was waiting. I could almost hear its breath on the other side. I stepped forward, key in hand. Ben stood behind me, his face pale, but determined. "This is it," I whispered, as I inserted the key into the door and slowly turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. I thought maybe we had gotten it wrong. But then, a low rumble filled the air. It started deep, like the earth itself was groaning, and the door, it rattled. The house shook. And then, the creature's growl sounded in the distance, faint but unmistakable. I turned the key, and I locked it. The sound that followed was like a scream, or perhaps it was the land itself crying out. But it didn't last long. The growling faded. The house settled. And then, silence. The oppressive weight lifted. The air cleared. It was as if the house had exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. We stood there for a long time, just listening. And then Ben spoke. "It's over, Jake. For now." But even as he said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still alive. That something was still waiting. Somewhere. Watching. It's been months now since I locked the door, months since the creature was, at least, temporarily sealed away. I should feel relieved, shouldn't I? Safe, finally free of whatever nightmare I had been living. But that's the thing about fear, it doesn't just vanish. And the memories of that thing still linger, like a shadow in the corner of my mind that refuses to fade. I went on with my life, trying to move forward, trying to convince myself that everything was normal again. I sold the house, couldn't stay there, not after everything that happened. I moved into a small apartment in the city, hoping that the bustling streets would drown out the silence that had haunted me. But last night, I received a letter. It was odd, seeing something like that in the mailbox, a letter with no return address, no name on the envelope. I almost didn't open it. But I did. I tore it open, hands shaking, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was jagged, barely legible, but one sentence stood out above the rest. The door was never locked. I froze. My stomach twisted. I looked around my apartment, the walls feeling suddenly too close, too small. The air grew thick. The weight of what I had done, or more importantly, what I hadn't done, pressed down on me like a vice. I thought the creature was gone, that it was finished when I locked the door that night. But had I really sealed it away for good? Or had I just been tricked into thinking I had control over it? I had no idea how the letter found me, how it even knew where I lived, but that didn't matter. I couldn't ignore it. My mind raced back to that night in the house, the growl, the shadow, the terrible, unnatural presence. The key had worked, hadn't it? I had locked the door. But had I locked it? I couldn't go back. I knew that. I couldn't risk facing that thing again. I couldn't. But then, something inside me whispered that I didn't have a choice. The creature had been waiting, watching, knowing that the door had been left ajar. That no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was over, it wouldn't be. It had never truly left. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was going to call Ben. I needed to know if he'd gotten a similar letter, if he knew anything about this. But before I could hit send, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, and I heard it, the tapping sound. Soft. Deliberate. Just like it had been the first time. It was at the door. I rushed to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, just like before, but it was different now. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the apartment. The door handle turned. Slowly. Then it rattled. I stood frozen, watching, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. The creature, had it followed me? How was it possible? No one could know about the door, the key. But somehow, it knew. And it was coming for me. I didn't know what to do anymore. There was no amulet, no strange key to lock things away. No Ben to help. All I had was the door, the thing behind it, and the choice. I could run. I could try to escape, but the creature had always been faster. It would catch me. It would find me no matter where I went. Or I could face it. But this time, it would be different. This time, I would not run. I would end this. I walked toward the door, my hands cold, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I could feel its presence, cold, waiting, just beyond the door. And as I turned the handle, I prepared myself for what came next. The door swung open. But instead of the creature, I saw nothing. The hallway beyond was empty, silent. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that the letter had been a trick, a final ploy to mess with my mind. But then, something grabbed me from behind. It wasn't the creature, but a force, cold, dark, alive, that pulled me into the darkness, pulling me into a world I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't scream. It was over. And as I was pulled into the abyss, I realized the truth: the creature had never been bound. The house was never meant to be locked. The key was never the answer. I had been its prey the entire time. And now, the door is always open.